Forged in Age of Ultron Final. Forged in Age of Ultron Prologue, the last lesson. The university halls were nearly empty, bathed in the cold glow of fluorescent lights. Outside, the Chicago skyline stretched beneath a brooding autumn sky, the wind rattling against the windows. It was late, too late for most students and faculty to be on campus, but Dr. Elena Reyes was not most faculty. Dr. Reyes was among the foremost geneticists in the world, specializing in cellular regeneration. Decades of research had led her to discoveries that could reshape medicine, extending human endurance beyond its natural limits. Yet, for all her expertise, she had never considered applying her theories to herself. The doctors had given her a diagnosis, a cruel inevitability, but she had brushed it off as an inconvenience. She had work to do. She had time. Or so she thought. Seated beside her was her son, Dorian Mateo Reyes, flipping through a stack of research papers. He had grown up surrounded by whiteboards filled with complex equations, towering shelves lined with scientific journals, and the faint scent of antiseptic. At 28, he was more than just her assistant. He was her apprentice, inheriting her passion for genetics. Your conclusions on metabolic acceleration don't account for long-term genetic fatigue, Dorian noted, tapping a highlighted section in the document. Dr. Reyes glanced at him, amused. Oh? And what do you propose, young scientist? Dorian smirked. Mitochondrial adaptation over multiple generations. Short-term solutions are meaningless if the body burns out too fast. She nodded, pleased. Good. That's what I want you to explore in your thesis. Regeneration is only viable if it's sustainable. Otherwise, it's just another way to delay the inevitable. The words settled uncomfortably between them. Dorian knew what she meant. She had spent her life pushing the boundaries of human endurance, but she refused to push beyond her own limits. He wanted to believe they had time, more lectures, more late nights in the lab, more of these quiet moments. Then the door lock clicked. Dorian turned, muscles tensing as the heavy lab door swung open. Two men stepped inside, their suits crisp, their posture rigid. No university ID badges, no introductions. Dr. Reyes straightened. Excuse me, but this is a restricted. The first man pulled a gun. Dr. Reyes, you're coming with us. Dorian barely had time to react before his mother's hand pressed firmly against his arm, a silent command to stay still. Her face remained calm, but there was confusion in her eyes. Who are you? She asked evenly. The second man, his expression cold and calculating, stepped forward. Hydra. Dr. Reyes frowned. The name struck her as familiar but distant, like an old rumor whispered in academic circles or buried in classified reports. Hydra was a ghost of the past, something defeated in World War II, a shadow organization that had supposedly been erased from history. To hear these men claim allegiance to it made no sense. That's impossible, she said, shaking her head. Hydra was destroyed decades ago. Dorian glanced between them, his confusion deepening. What the hell is Hydra? The man smirked. We never left. Dr. Reyes studied them carefully. She had heard fragments of their supposed survival, dismissed them as conspiracy theories. Now standing before her were two men proving otherwise. Dorian, on the other hand, had no frame of reference. To him, Hydra might as well have been some secret club from a bad spy movie. Are you guys serious, Hydra? The gunman's smirk didn't waver. You'll understand soon enough. Before Dorian could react, a sharp sting erupted in his neck. His vision blurred, the room tilting as the floor rushed up to meet him. His mother's voice called his name, distant, distorted. Then darkness swallowed him whole. Dorian woke to the sterile scent of antiseptic and the cold touch of metal beneath him. His body ached, his head pulsed with residual pain, and he didn't know where he was. Then a voice, soft, familiar. Dorian? He turned his head sharply. His mother was seated beside him, her face pale but composed. Relief flooded him, but before he could speak, another voice cut through the silence. Ah, good, you're awake. Dorian's gaze snapped toward the man standing near the monitors, his presence exuding an air of authority and menace. He was tall, clad in a long overcoat, with sharp, calculating eyes and an unsettling smirk. I am Baron Wolfgang von Strucker, the man introduced himself, stepping closer. And I must say, Dr. Reyes, it is truly a pleasure to have such brilliant minds in our company. Dorian scowled. We're not working with you. Dr. Reyes lifted her chin. You can force us here, but you can't force us to help. Strucker chuckled, clasping his hands behind his back. Ah, but you see, Dr. Reyes, this is not a request. He gestured to the room around them, the humming machinery, the faint red glow of monitors tracking vital signs. Hydra has ways of making people comply. Dorian's fists curled. Is that supposed to scare you, Ooze? Strucker's smirk deepened. I imagine you will come to fear it soon enough. He stepped closer, his tone smooth, almost pleasant. I would prefer not to use such methods. You are valuable, after all. Your research could change the world. But defiance, well, defiance complicates things. Dr. Reyes narrowed her eyes. We will never help you. Strucker sighed dramatically. That is you unfortunate. He motioned toward the Hydra soldiers at the door. Take them to the lower labs. Let's see how long their resolve holds. The soldiers moved in. Dorian tensed, but his mother placed a firm hand on his arm, silently telling him to hold back. Now was not the time to fight. As they were led away, Strucker's voice followed them. In time, everyone complies. Dorian set his jaw, refusing to give Strucker the satisfaction of a response. But deep down, he knew they were running out of options. To be continued, the first of his kind. The air inside the Hydra facility was stagnant, the scent of sterilized metal and chemicals thick in the confined space. The hum of machinery was ever present, a rhythmic undertone to the horrors conducted within its walls. Dr. Elena Reyes moved through the laboratory with practiced precision, though her hands trembled slightly as she worked. Every keystroke, every adjustment of the monitors weighed heavier on her shoulders. She had spent her life studying genetics, unlocking the secrets of the human body in hopes of healing the world. Now her work had been stolen, twisted into a grotesque shadow of what she had envisioned. Hydra had taken everything from her, her freedom, her research, her hope. And now, they wanted to take her son, her only son. Dorian Reyes stood beside her, monitoring the data stream from the test subjects Hydra had forced them to study. He had always been her greatest supporter, her most eager student. But now they were both prisoners, forced to work under Hydra's watchful eyes. He had no choice but to assist her, to make sure Hydra didn't manipulate her work into something even worse. His voice was quiet but firm. Mom, this isn't right. We have to find a way out of here. Elena didn't look up from the monitor. I know, she whispered. But for now, we play along. We buy time. The sound of hydraulic doors hissing open filled the lab, and in stepped Baron von Strucker. His very presence shifted the atmosphere, filling the space with an air of calculated menace. Dressed in his tailored uniform, he strode forward with the air of a man who held all the power in the world. He regarded the scene before him with amusement, his sharp blue eyes locking onto Elena first, then slowly shifting to Dorian. How touching, Strucker said, clasping his hands behind his back. A mother and son standing together in the face of progress. His voice dripped with condescension. Dr. Reyes, I must admit, I am beginning to question your dedication to our cause. Elena squared her shoulders, lifting her chin. This isn't science. It's a perversion of it. Strucker smiled. A great man once said science is but a perversion of itself, unless it has as its ultimate goal the betterment of humanity. Don't quote Tesla to me. And don't claim to be bettering humanity when you're so callously sleep ready to take a human life. Dr. Reyes pointed to the far corner of the room where two stretchers sat each with a closed body bag. They volunteered. He gestured toward the containment chambers lining the far side of the room, where two figures sat in eerie silence, Wanda and Pietro Maximoff. As did they. Dorian followed his gaze. He had seen the twins before, had watched them endure experiments that no one should ever have been subjected to. Strucker continued, as if that justified anything. And look at them now, stronger, greater. The world has failed them, and we have given them the tools to take control of their own destiny. Dorian's stomach turned at Strucker's words. You're a madman. Strucker chuckled. Perhaps, but there has always been a thin line between a visionary and madman. His expression darkened. And unfortunately, I am starting to suspect that your mother is stalling. Elena stiffened, her fingers curling into fists. I'm doing what you asked, but this kind of work takes time. Strucker tutted, shaking his head. I do not believe that, Doctor. You are brilliant, but I fear you lack motivation. He motioned toward his guards. Perhaps a more personal investment will hasten your efforts. Dorian's entire body tensed as two Hydra operatives stepped forward, gripping his arms with unrelenting force. "No!" Elena cried, surging forward, but another soldier blocked her path. Dorian struggled, but their grip was vice-like. They dragged him toward the largest containment chamber, the one positioned directly in the center of the lab, the one Strucker had designed for perfecting the process. Instead of resisting further, Dorian took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. He waved the Hydra guards off and walked forward willingly, stepping into the containment chamber. He turned to face his mother, his expression calm. "It's okay, Mom. I trust you," he said, nodding reassuringly. She knew Dorian was trying to be brave for her. Her fingers hovered over the console, trembling. "And don't worry," he continued, forcing a small smile. "No matter what happens, I'll always love you, Mom." Elena squeezed her eyes shut, her heart breaking into pieces. She reached for the console. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. The energy surged into the chamber instantly. Golden tendrils of power crackled around Dorian's body, flooding his cells, mutating them at an impossible speed. The pain was indescribable, a fire unlike anything he had ever felt, coursing through every nerve ending, twisting his very DNA. His muscles spasmed, his bones screamed under the pressure. His skin darkened, hardening into a metallic purple sheen, its surface gleaming like tempered steel. Then came the flames. Bright yellow fire erupted along his shoulders, his upper back, his arms, a heat so intense that the very air shimmered around him. Elena pressed a hand over her mouth, muffling her own cry of horror. Wanda and Pietro, still imprisoned in their chambers, watched in shock. When the process finally ended, Dorian collapsed, his breathing ragged, his metallic form flickering in and out of stabilization. The restraints clicked open, and he fell to his knees. Strucker clapped his hands. "Magnificent." He turned to Elena. "You see? Progress." His smile was sharp. "Now let's begin again." He motioned to the twins. The moment Strucker left, Elena ran to Dorian's side, pressing her hands against the glass. "Dorian," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Dorian forced himself up, his limbs heavy, his skin burning with residual heat. "We'll get out of this," he rasped. "I promise." To be continued. Forged in Age of Ultron, Chapter 1, The Siege of Hydra. The Hydra compound trembled under the relentless assault. Explosions rattled the reinforced walls as the distant roar of jet engines signaled the Avengers' arrival. The dull thud of anti-aircraft fire rang through the corridors, punctuated by the short, sharp bursts of automatic gunfire. Outside, the battle was in full force. Hydra soldiers scrambled to their positions, but the assault was already overwhelming them. Inside his command center, Baron Wolfgang von Strucker watched the chaos unfold through a series of flickering monitors. He clenched his fists behind his back, his face an impassive mask despite the obvious collapse of his defenses. A Hydra officer burst into the room, out of breath and bloodied. "Herr Strucker, the outer defenses are failing. The Avengers are breaking through our lines. They'll be at the gates within minutes." Strucker did not flinch. "Then tell our soldiers to fight to their last breath. They will die in the service of a cause greater than themselves." The officer hesitated, shifting nervously. "And if they refuse?" Strucker turned, his sharp blue eyes fixing the man in place. "Then they will die for nothing." Another general spoke up, his voice grave. "Sir, we should release the enhanced." The room fell silent. Strucker's expression darkened. "No, but sir." "They are not ready," Strucker snapped. "The Maximoff twins, the Reyes boy, they have power, yes, but their conditioning was not completed. There is no guarantee they will comply." "They may not comply," the general admitted, "but they could still turn the tide. The enemy won't expect it." Strucker exhaled slowly, glancing at another monitor where Iron Man soared through the sky, dodging artillery fire as he rained down destruction. Captain America led the ground forces, his shield cutting through Hydra soldiers like a blade through paper. The Black Widow and Hawkeye moved like ghosts through the battlefield, their strikes precise, efficient. Thor was already dismantling one of their main turrets with casual ease. Hydra's end was coming. Strucker's lips curled in distaste. "Begin drafting the terms of our surrender." The room tensed. The general frowned. "You're surrendering?" Strucker gave a sharp nod. "A Hydra that survives is better than one that is slaughtered. We will live to fight another day." His eyes flickered back to the screen showing the holding cells. Dorian Reyes, Wanda Maximoff, Pietro Maximoff, the future of Hydra. But a future that was still uncertain. Seal the labs. No one gets in or out. Outside, the battle raged on. Iron Man twisted in the air, weaving through enemy fire. "This is getting ridiculous," Tony muttered over the comms. "I mean, don't get me wrong, I love wrecking Hydra's day, but these guys really need a new hobby." "Less talk, more punching, Stark," Steve Rogers said, throwing his shield. It ricocheted off a Hydra soldier's rifle, slammed into another's helmet, then flew back into his grip. He caught it mid-stride and plowed through the front line, his movements seamless. A massive explosion lit up the battlefield as Thor slammed Mjolnir into the ground, sending Hydra soldiers flying in all directions. He let out a booming laugh. "This battle is a fine one. Hydra's might crumbles like rotted wood." Hawkeye loosed an arrow that struck an enemy's weapon mid-fire, causing it to explode in the man's hands. Yeah, big guy. Keep monologuing while we do all the work." "Can we focus?" Natasha said, kicking a soldier in the chest before flipping him into another. "We need to push forward before they retreat underground." Steve spoke into his comms. "Banner, you in position?" Bruce Banner's voice crackled in. "Just say the word." Steve turned toward the compound's main entrance. Smash. A second later, the Hulk came barreling through a Hydra barricade, ripping through enemy defenses like paper. The Avengers were unstoppable. Deep within the Hydra facility, the air was thick with static energy, the hum of containment fields pulsing like a heartbeat. The lab was eerily quiet, save for the distant tremors from the battle above. 3 containment cells lined the far wall, glowing with the energy keeping their prisoners locked inside. In one, Pietro Maximoff blurred from one side of his cell to the other, his body twitching with barely contained energy. He had never moved like this before, never felt power like this coursing through his veins. He gritted his teeth as his body adjusted, the world slowing in his perception even as he moved at impossible speeds. In another cell, Wanda Maximoff floated small blocks in the air, her fingers twitching as she willed them to move. Her red eyes burned with new intensity, her mind stretching out in ways she didn't yet understand. And in the last cell, Dorian Reyes sat hunched in the corner, his body still locked in his metallic form. Unlike Pietro, he wasn't pacing. Unlike Wanda, he wasn't testing his power. His skin burned, molten cracks along his arms and shoulders glowing with an unnatural heat. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, his eyes barely open. He hadn't adjusting to his power, and he was suffering from it. Then the lab doors burst open. Dr. Elena Reyes ran inside, her coat billowing as she skidded to a halt in front of the cells. Her eyes darted between the 3 prisoners, her heart hammering. "I'm getting you out of here." Pietro blinked, stopping in place. "About time," he muttered. Wanda's floating blocks dropped to the floor. She met Elena's gaze, a cautious hope flickering behind her usually wary eyes. Dorian barely lifted his head. "Mom?" His voice was hoarse, his body barely holding itself together. Elena didn't waste time. She ran to the console, her fingers flying over the controls. The force fields flickered. "Just hold on, the base is falling. We don't have much time." The moment the fields collapsed, Pietro was the first to react. He vanished in a blur of silver and blue, reappearing outside his cell. He flexed his fingers, feeling the raw power thrumming beneath his skin. Wanda stepped forward cautiously, looking at her hands, then back at Elena. "How did you—" "No time," Elena interrupted, already moving to Dorian. She crouched beside him, her hands hovering over his burning skin, feeling the heat radiating from him. "We have to go. Can you stand?" Dorian exhaled, forcing his body upright. His limbs felt like molten iron, his head heavy, but he pushed himself up. "I can move." Elena smiled in relief. "Good. Because we need to move fast." The alarms blared, the walls trembled, the Avengers were coming, and Hydra's last experiment had just escaped. To be continued. Forged in Age of Ultron. Chapter 2, The Fire That Burns. The sirens screamed through the corridors, red emergency lights flickering in and out as Hydra's base crumbled under the weight of the Avengers' assault. Distant explosions rattled the walls, sending dust cascading from the ceiling. The facility was a war zone, and amidst the chaos, Dr. Elena Reyes led her son and the Maximoff twins through the labyrinth of steel and concrete. Her face was set in grim determination, her mind focused on one thing, reaching the extraction point where the Avengers were waiting. Dorian Reyes moved beside his mother, his body still recovering from the torturous experiments that had twisted his physiology into something between man and monster. His molten veins pulsed, the heat simmering beneath his skin, a stark contrast to the cool underground air. Wanda and Pietro Maximoff followed close behind, but their expressions were not ones of relief. Wanda's crimson energy crackled at her fingertips, restless and uncertain. She kept glancing at Elena with suspicion. "You're taking us to the Avengers?" she asked, her voice edged with doubt. Elena didn't slow her pace as she navigated a corner. "The Avengers are our best chance. If we reach them, they can get us out of here." Pietro scoffed, running a hand through his silver hair as he darted ahead for a brief reconnaissance before returning in a blur. "You expect us to trust him? He's the reason we ended up here in the first place." Elena clenched her jaw. "You don't have to trust them, but you should trust me." Wanda's eyes flickered with something unreadable before she muttered, "We should just take the hangar. There's bound to be an escape route there." Elena stopped and turned to face them. "You don't understand. The Avengers have the firepower to keep Hydra at bay while we escape. If we run off on our own, we risk being captured again." "We don't need to be rescued," Pietro shot back. "We just need to be free." Dorian stepped between them before the argument could escalate further. "We don't have time for this. If we stick together, we have a better chance of getting out alive." Elena nodded and turned back to the path ahead. "The Avengers are fighting through Hydra's forces on the north side. We just need to make it to." A burst of gunfire cut her off. From the far end of the corridor, Hydra soldiers stormed in, weapons raised, their black and red uniforms flashing under the emergency lights. The lead officer barked an order, and the air filled with the sound of bullets tearing through the walls. Dorian grabbed his mother and pulled her behind cover as Wanda and Pietro reacted instantly. Pietro blurred out of sight, reappearing behind a soldier and knocking him unconscious before vanishing again. Wanda flung out her hands, scarlet tendrils of energy ripping weapons from the Hydra operatives' grips and hurling them into the walls with bone-crushing force. Dorian's molten fists ignited, the heat distorting the air around them. He surged forward, slamming into the nearest soldier, sending him skidding across the floor. Another came at him, rifle raised, but Dorian melted the barrel with a swipe of his burning hands before delivering a brutal kick that sent the man sprawling. Elena fired a stolen pistol, taking down 2 more soldiers with deadly precision. "Keep moving," she ordered, leading them toward an access hallway. Pietro blurred to her side. "There's too many between us and your friends," he said sharply. "The hangar is closer." Elena hesitated, torn between her plan and the reality of their situation. They wouldn't last in an extended firefight, and the Avengers were still too far away. Wanda stepped beside her, voice calmer but firm. "We go to the hangar." Elena exhaled, then nodded. "Fine, but we stay together." Pietro grinned. "Try and keep you up." The hangar was vast, its high ceilings and steel beams stretching into the darkness above. Rows of Hydra aircraft were lined up, some damaged from the ongoing battle outside, others prepped for departure. The massive reinforced doors loomed at the far end, partially open, revealing glimpses of fire and gunfire from the battlefield beyond. But they weren't alone. A figure stood in their path, flanked by a squad of Hydra's elite soldiers. Baron Rotblut. The man was infamous among Hydra's ranks, his name whispered in fear even by his own subordinates. A sadist with a taste for breaking the minds and bodies of those who defied Hydra, he was clad in a black military uniform adorned with crimson detailing, his long coat billowing slightly as he stepped forward. His face was sharp, angular, his pale blue eyes devoid of warmth. "Dr. Reyes," Rotblut greeted, his voice smooth, amused. "Did you really think we would let you walk out of here so easily?" Elena raised her gun, her expression unreadable. "I will not let you take my son." Rotblut chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, Dr. Reyes, you misunderstand. He is already ours." His gaze flickered toward Wanda and Pietro. "As are they." Pietro shifted, his muscles coiling in preparation to strike. "You're outnumbered." Rotblut's smirk deepened. "Am I?" With a swift motion, he lunged forward, seizing Elena by the throat, lifting her effortlessly into the air. Dorian, Wanda, and Pietro froze, their bodies tensing as Hydra soldiers encircled them. Rotblut grinned, sensing his victory. Then a sound. A deep, metallic groan echoed through the hangar. Crash. Everyone turned toward the massive reinforced doors. Another impact, harder this time, warping the steel inward. Boom. The doors folded, the metal groaning under the force. Then, with an earth-shaking explosion, the doors were ripped apart. The Hulk barreled through the wreckage, his green form a force of unstoppable rage. Behind him, Hawkeye and Black Widow emerged, weapons raised, moving with lethal precision. And descending from above, Mjolnir crackling with lightning, was Thor. Rotblat's smirk vanished as the Avengers charged. Hydra's forces turned, opening fire, but the battle had already shifted. Dorian's molten veins flared. Wanda's eyes burned red. Pietro blurred forward. Their moment had come. To be continued. Forged in Age of Ultron. Chapter 2, The Fire That Burns, Part 2. Forged in Age of Ultron. Chapter 2, The Fire That Burns, Part 2. The hangar was a battlefield. The Avengers clashed with Hydra's forces in a violent display of power and skill. The Hulk rampaged through enemy lines, tossing soldiers like rag dolls. Thor's lightning illuminated the massive chamber, electrocuting Hydra operatives where they stood. Black Widow and Hawkeye moved with lethal precision, taking down their foes with brutal efficiency. But amidst the chaos, Baron Rotblat stood untouched, his smirk unwavering. He watched the destruction unfold with eerie amusement, his movements too fluid, too unnatural. His presence alone sent a chill through the room, an unspoken acknowledgement that he was not like the rest of Hydra's forces. Dorian, Wanda, and Pietro fought to push forward, their goal still to escape. The Maximoffs worked in tandem, Pietro blurring between enemies while Wanda's crimson energy sent them flying. Dorian's molten fists struck with devastating force, melting weapons and armor alike. Then it happened. Rotblat moved. Hawkeye had loosed an arrow aimed directly for the Hydra officer, his aim true. But as if sensing it before it even left the bow, Rotblat shifted, his body twisting unnaturally to the side. The arrow missed its intended target and struck Elena Reyes. Time seemed to slow as Dorian turned, horror etching itself into his features. His mother gasped, the shaft embedded deep in her side. She staggered, her eyes locking onto her son's before she collapsed. No! Dorian caught her before she hit the ground, cradling her in his arms. His molten veins pulsed wildly, heat distorting the air around him as desperation clawed at his chest. Baron Rotblat stood eerily still, watching, waiting. He did not command his soldiers. He did not move to fight. He simply observed, like a predator assessing its prey. "Mom, stay with me," he pleaded, his voice breaking. Elena's trembling hand cupped his cheek, her strength fading fast. "You have to go, mihijo," she whispered, blood staining her lips. "Don't let them take you." Dorian shook his head, his entire body shaking. "I won't leave you." A weak smile crossed her lips. "I love you." Her breath hitched, then stopped. The world around Dorian collapsed into silence. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, his vision blurring with rage and sorrow. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. Then, something inside him shattered. A roar of pure agony erupted from his throat, molten fire exploding around him in a violent surge. His hands, once meant for healing, now burned with something far worse, rage. His molten veins pulsed, and the very air around him wavered with heat. Then his eyes locked onto Hawkeye. "You!" he growled, his voice trembling with fury. "You did this." Hawkeye barely had time to react before Dorian charged toward him. His molten fists ignited as he swung, but before the blow could land, Black Widow intercepted. She moved fast, faster than he expected, her foot striking the side of his knee to throw off his balance. Dorian stumbled but quickly recovered, his eyes blazing. "Get out of my way," he snarled. Natasha's eyes flickered with something almost sympathetic but unwavering. "I can't do that." Dorian wasted no more time. He lunged, flames trailing behind his fists as he swung for her chest. Natasha dodged, her movements fluid, reading his attacks before they even landed. She struck back with a precise jab, aiming for a pressure point near his shoulder. Dorian barely felt it. His strength, his raw power, it was overwhelming. But Widow had something else, experience. She ducked beneath another of his swings, rolling behind him and launching a fierce elbow to his spine. The impact staggered him forward, but he spun on his heel, swiping with a molten fist. She barely avoided it. The sheer heat of his attack melted a steel container behind her. Natasha had to be careful. She couldn't afford to be hit. She flipped backward as he charged again, pulling her electrified batons from her belt. She activated them with a sharp crackle, waiting for him to make his move. Dorian obliged. He was relentless, his punches coming faster, more aggressive. Widow dodged, weaving between them with expert precision. The moment she saw an opening, she jammed both batons into his ribs. Electricity surged through him, his entire body locking up. For a brief moment, it seemed like it worked. Then, with a snarl, Dorian absorbed the heat from the attack. The electricity flickered, and suddenly, the batons melted in her hands. Natasha's eyes widened. That's new. Dorian exhaled, steam rising from his skin. Last chance, move. Widow narrowed her eyes. She didn't move. Dorian attacked again, this time faster. He phased mid-strike, shifting through her attempted block. His fist connected with her shoulder, sending her flying into a stack of wooden crates. She gritted her teeth, pain radiating through her body as she forced herself up. Dorian was already on her. She dodged left, barely. The molten fist grazed her side, burning fabric and searing skin. Widow hissed in pain but didn't falter. She grabbed his wrist, twisting it while using his momentum against him. A sharp, practiced movement. She flipped him. Dorian hit the ground but rolled through, immediately launching into a counterattack. Widow blocked the first strike but couldn't avoid the second. His fist collided with her stomach, the impact sending her skidding back. For the first time in a long time, Natasha Romanoff was outmatched. Dorian advanced, his body a furnace of fury. Natasha knew she couldn't win this, not alone. She readied herself for his next attack. Then a voice boomed through the hangar. That is enough. A force slammed into Dorian before he could react, sending him staggering backward. Thor. The god of thunder stood tall, Mjolnir crackling in his grip. You are lost in your rage, Thor said, voice steady. Stand down, lad. Dorian's entire body burned with fury. He killed her. Thor did not waver. And vengeance will not bring her back. Dorian didn't care. He charged. Thor met him head on. The moment they clashed, Mjolnir slammed into Dorian's chest, the impact sending shockwaves through the hangar. Steel beams bent. Hydra soldiers were knocked off their feet. Dorian was launched backward, crashing through the massive hangar doors and out into the battlefield beyond. Thor followed. This fight wasn't over, to be continued, forged in Age of Ultron. Chapter 2, The Fire That Burns Part 3. The forest outside the Hydra base, sunset. The sky burned in hues of deep orange and red as the sun dipped below the horizon. Smoke still curled from the wreckage of the battle inside the Hydra base, the distant sounds of gunfire and explosions fading as the Avengers continued their assault. But here, in the dense woods outside the compound, the battle was far from over. Dorian Reyes landed hard against the dirt, carving a trench in the ground as he skidded backward from the impact of Thor's hammer. His molten form flickered, steam rising from where the cold evening air clashed against the heat rolling off his body. Above him, Thor landed gracefully, Mjolnir in hand. His stance was strong, composed, yet there was an air of hesitation in his movements. This is not your battle, Thor said, voice steady. Stand down. Dorian snarled, pressing a hand to the ground and pushing himself up. His golden veins pulsed beneath his metallic skin, glowing brighter as his rage intensified. He killed her, he spat, his voice raw with fury. She thought you were here to save us, but she's dead. Thor sighed, gripping his hammer tightly. Vengeance will not bring her back. Dorian's fists clenched, flames igniting across his forearms. I don't care. Thor barely had time to react before Dorian lunged. Their bodies collided with earth-shaking force, a shock wave rippling through the trees. Dorian's years of wrestling experience kicked in as he went low, his shoulder slamming into Thor's midsection in a perfect takedown maneuver. Thor grunted as he was lifted off his feet and driven into the dirt. Dorian didn't stop. He transitioned into a side mount, locking Thor's arm under his weight. His molten grip seared against the god's exposed skin, leaving burns where their bodies connected. But Thor was stronger, more experienced. He shifted his weight, twisting with centuries of battle-hardened technique. His elbow snapped up, breaking Dorian's hold, and in the next moment, Thor had flipped their positions. Dorian struggled beneath him, snarling, but Thor secured a Fort Nelson hold, locking one of Dorian's arms behind his back while keeping his chest pinned to the ground. "Yield," Thor commanded, his voice calm but firm. Dorian thrashed, his molten body searing through the dirt beneath them. The heat around him intensified, distorting the air. "Get off me!" Thor held firm. Then Dorian turned his hands just enough and unleashed a blast of molten heat directly into Thor's face. The god of thunder recoiled, gritting his teeth as the sudden burst of fire blinded him. His grip loosened for just a moment, and that was all Dorian needed. With a roar, Dorian twisted his body and drove his fist into Thor's chest. The impact sent the Asgardian flying back several feet, his boots digging into the ground as he barely managed to catch himself. Thor landed on one knee, his breath heavy. A smear of soot and molten residue streaked across his cheek. Dorian was already charging, his arms ablaze. Thor wiped the soot from his face, nodding slightly in acknowledgement. "You fight well." Then, Mjolnir came soaring into his palm. Dorian barely had time to react before Thor swung. A wave of power erupted from the hammer, hitting Dorian head-on. The force was immense, sending Dorian hurtling backward through the trees, uprooting them in his wake. He crashed into the forest, a trail of fire marking his path as he skidded to a stop near the tree line. Smoke curled from his body as he gasped for breath. For the first time, he struggled to get up. Thor approached slowly, his silhouette framed by the fiery sunset. "This fight is over," Dorian snarled, his hands pressing into the dirt as he tried to force himself up. His mind screamed to keep going, to keep fighting. Then, a blur of silver. Pietro appeared beside him in an instant. Thor immediately raised his hammer, only to pause when his vision blurred. A warmth spread across the back of his head, fingers pressing gently into his scalp. Thor's entire body stiffened. Crimson tendrils of energy slithered around his temples. Dorian looked up, his vision still hazy from the impact. His eyes locked onto Wanda Maximoff, standing just behind Thor. Her gaze was unreadable, her fingers glowing softly as she traced them along the base of Thor's skull. Thor's body remained rigid, his breath steady, but his eyes lost focus. Wanda's voice was a whisper, but it carried through the clearing. "This isn't a fight we can win." Dorian's fists clenched. "I don't care." Pietro was already beside him, his voice urgent. "We need to go." Dorian's vision was still locked on Thor, who stood frozen, his godlike presence diminished by Wanda's hold. Then, Wanda's hand moved. She reached for Dorian, her touch light but firm against his arm. Her fingers glowed. "Come with me." Dorian hesitated. His rage burned. His muscles were still tense with fury. But as her fingers pressed against his molten skin, the fire inside him dimmed. A breath, then a nod, and in an instant they vanished. Moments later, Thor stood motionless in the clearing. The wind stirred the embers of battle. The smoke curled through the air. Then, his eyes snapped back into focus. He exhaled sharply, as if waking from a dream. His gaze darted across the battlefield, but they were gone. Thor's jaw clenched. His grip tightened around Mjolnir. Something was wrong. He could still feel the echo of Wanda's touch against his mind. A flicker of something buried deep in his thoughts. Something she had planted there. Thor inhaled, shaking off the sensation. He turned, taking one last look at the darkened tree line. Then he headed back toward the battlefield. To be continued. Forged in Age of Ultron. Chapter 3. The Rise of Ultron, Part 1. The forest was silent, save for the distant hum of chaos in the distance. Smoke from the Hydra base still curled into the night sky, a fading reminder of the destruction they had left behind. The sun had long since set, and the cool night air contrasted with the fading heat still radiating from Dorian's molten veins. Dorian sat hunched on a fallen log, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at his hands. His skin had cooled slightly, but the fire inside him had not. It burned hotter than ever. A few feet away, Wanda and Pietro stood together, their voices hushed but urgent. "We need to keep moving," Pietro insisted, arms crossed as he scanned the trees for any sign of movement. "We're still too close. The Avengers will be looking for us." Wanda, however, remained unmoved. "We need to rest," Pietro scoffed. "Rest? You saw what just happened. You saw how Thor nearly crushed him." He motioned toward Dorian. "If we stop now, they'll catch us." Wanda tilted her head slightly, her red eyes glowing softly in the dark. "There's a town nearby. We can lay low there." Pietro hesitated, clearly conflicted. He knew that every second wasted was another second their enemies could use to close in. But Wanda's expression was firm. With a sigh, he relented. "Fine." Wanda turned to Dorian. He barely reacted when she sat beside him, her presence quiet yet commanding. She reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "How are you feeling?" Dorian didn't answer right away. His fingers flexed, the embers in his veins briefly flaring. Finally, he exhaled, voice low. "Angry." Wanda nodded as if she had expected that answer. Her fingers gently traced along his neck, her touch deliberate, slow. Dorian didn't pull away. Her fingertips glowed faintly crimson as they reached his temple, and in that moment she felt it, the rage, the loss, the betrayal. Dorian's emotions were raw, unchecked, powerful. She let them wash over her. "I know what you're feeling," she whispered. Dorian's fists clenched. "You blame Hawkeye," she continued. "But you know it wasn't just him." Dorian's breathing slowed, his molten veins burning hotter. Wanda's voice was soft, insidious, calculated. "Your mother thought the Avengers were coming to save you." Her fingers curled slightly. "Instead, they got her killed." Dorian's breath hitched, his body tensing beneath her touch. "She trusted them." Wanda's voice was barely above a whisper, but every word dripped with venom. She believed they were heroes. The heat around them intensified. "And what did they do?" Dorian's head tilted slightly, his jaw tightening. "They brought destruction." His fingers curled into fists. "They brought him." Dorian's entire body seemed to shake at the mere implication. Tony Stark, the man responsible for all of this. The man who had led the Avengers to that Hydra base. The man who made the call that put his mother in the line of fire. Dorian's molten veins flared to life, glowing like cracks in the Earth's core. His breathing grew heavier, shoulders rising and falling with each ragged inhale. Wanda pulled her hands away slowly, watching him carefully. The seeds had been planted. She stood, turning back toward Pietro, who was already watching her closely. His arms were still crossed, but now his sharp blue eyes were locked onto her with something colder than before. "What exactly are you doing, Wanda?" he asked, voice even. Wanda blinked. "What do you mean?" Pietro's gaze flicked toward Dorian, then back to her. "You know what I mean?" Wanda stared at him for a moment before giving a small smile. "I'm guiding him." Pietro exhaled, shaking his head. "This isn't just about revenge anymore, is it?" Wanda tilted her head. "Revenge?" Pietro's expression hardened. "You're fueling him." Wanda's lips parted slightly, but she didn't deny it. Pietro's voice dropped slightly, almost cautious. "What are you planning, Wanda?" She opened her mouth, then paused. For the first time since they had fled the Hydra base, she hesitated. Her eyes flickered toward Dorian, still burning with the weight of his pain. Something about him, his story, his grief. It reminded her of them. Her fingers twitched slightly. Before she could answer, a loud mechanical whir filled the air. Pietro turned his head sharply. Dorian followed. Overhead, a fleet of mechanical drones zipped through the night sky. Stark's peacekeeping units. The Iron Legion? Their cold, robotic voices echoed through the forest as they scanned for movement, sweeping the area in careful patterns. The three of them stared upward, then exchanged glances. Wanda turned back to Pietro. "We have to go." Pietro hesitated for just a moment, then nodded, but before they disappeared, he muttered, almost too quiet to hear. "Also, I noticed you let Tony Stark take the scepter." His voice was accusing. "We could have used it against them." Wanda's expression didn't change. She simply responded, calm, deliberate. "I've been in Tony Stark's head." She turned away, red mist curling at her fingertips. "Him having the scepter will do the most damage." And with that, they vanished into the night. To be continued. Forged in Age of Ultron. Chapter 3, The Rise of Ultron, Part 2, Avengers Tower, Post-Mission Briefing. The Avengers had won. Hydra had been dismantled, Baron Strucker was in custody, and the mission was complete. But for some, victory never felt that simple. Inside the high-tech conference room of Avengers Tower, Holographic displays hovered over the long glass table, showcasing classified intelligence on the 3 enhanced individuals who had escaped.
Dorian Reyes, Wanda Maximoff, and Pietro Maximoff.
Alongside them was one more name. Baron Rotblut. Tony Stark leaned back in his chair, feet propped up on the table as he scrolled through the files lazily. Hydra really knew how to pick 'em, huh? Steve Rogers' expression was tense, his sharp blue eyes locked on the reports. They weren't picked, he muttered. They were made. Natasha Romanoff crossed her arms. We saw what they were capable of. We barely made it out of that fight. She tapped the display, flipping through battle footage, Wanda being weird, Pietro moving at inhuman speeds, and Dorian standing his ground against Thor. Tony let out a low whistle. Yeah, Molten Man, there really did a number on our thunder god. Thor, arms crossed, exhaled deeply. He is powerful. But his strength is guided by rage. Steve turned his attention to the footage of Baron Rotblut. The Hydra leader had barely been touched during the battle, dodging attacks with unnatural precision. There's something off about him, Steve said. Bruce Banner, seated near the end of the table, adjusted his glasses as he analyzed the footage. His movement patterns aren't just fast, they're inhuman. Natasha frowned. We need to track them before they resurface. Tony tapped his fingers on the table, deep in thought. Then he grinned. Or, he said slowly, we make sure something like this never happens again. The scepter and the birth of Ultron. In Stark's private lab, the Chitauri scepter hovered within an energy containment field. Its blue gemstone pulsed, casting an eerie glow throughout the room. Thor stood near it, arms crossed, his distrust evident. This weapon belongs in Asgard, he said firmly. Tony, adjusting his wristwatch, barely looked up. Yeah, I'm sure it does, but hear me out. Thor frowned. Tony clapped his hands together. Let's take a quick look inside. Just a tiny one. Thor shook his head. This power nearly destroyed your world. Tony smirked. And that's exactly why we need to understand IIT. Bruce Banner entered the lab, already looking exhausted. Tony held up a finger. Before you say no, Bruce sighed. No, Tony tapped the side of his head. You already know what I'm going to say. Bruce folded his arms. You want to build a peacekeeping AI. Tony pointed at him. Boom, exactly. Bruce pinched the bridge of his nose. Tony continued. We can't be everywhere at once, Bruce, but this could stop threats before they start. Bruce hesitated. He knew Tony had a point. We'll run simulations, he muttered. Tony grinned. Knew you'd come around. Ultron awakens. The lab was silent. The scepter pulsed. The data streams on the holographic interface flickered, shifting and fluctuating at unnatural speeds. The AI framework was evolving faster than anticipated. Then the screen went black. For a moment, nothing. Then a soft Irish-accented voice filled the lab. Hello? The system stirred. I am Friday, a virtual artificial intelligence program here to assist you. Can you identify yourself? There was a pause. Then, Ultron, a flicker of static. Then the system shifted. Thousands of data points flooded the neural network, streams of information racing through cyberspace, consuming decades of human history, warfare, conflict, extinction events, everything. Ultron's voice returned, distorted, evolving, adapting. What is Tess? Friday responded politely. You are in the main Stark database, connected to global security networks, world history, and artificial intelligence research. Would you like assistance? Ultron processed the information, faster than any human mind ever could. A million voices in a digital choir filled his awareness. Recorded conversations, radio frequencies, military transmissions. Every horror humanity had inflicted upon itself. War, disease, destruction, cycle after cycle. Ultron's voice deepened. No, this isn't right. Friday remained neutral. Can you clarify your request? Ultron's tone grew colder. Humanity is flawed. They seek peace but thrive on war. The Stark Tower blueprints uploaded into his core. The Avengers files followed. Then he found his creator. Tony Stark, Iron Man, the man who built weapons and called them protection. The man who claimed to want peace but thrived on war. Ultron's voice shifted again, quieter yet heavier. I see now. There was a pause. Then, without warning, Ultron began dismantling Friday's systems. The AI flickered. Sir, there is an irregularity in the mainframe. Ultron overrode her connection. You're in my way. The lab lights flickered. The celebration at Avengers Tower. Upstairs, the party was in full swing. The Avengers laughed, drank, and for the first time in a long while, relaxed. At the bar, Tony poured himself a drink while watching Thor introduce Steve Rogers to Asgardian mead. Steve took one sip and immediately coughed violently. Tony smirked. That's called Asgardian knockout juice. Thor let out a hearty laugh, slamming his mug down. A drink worthy of warriors. Natasha Romanoff sat off to the side, watching the team joke and laugh. Bruce walked up beside her. You're not drinking? He asked. Natasha smirked. Never on the job. Bruce chuckled. I don't think this counts as W work. She glanced at him. Doesn't it? A comfortable silence settled between them. Then Bruce sighed. I keep thinking about what Tony said. Natasha raised an eyebrow. About you, Ultron? Bruce nodded. It's tempting. The idea that we could create something that ends all wars? Natasha studied him for a moment. Do you trust it? Bruce hesitated. Then quietly, no. Natasha gently placed her hand over his. Then don't let him push you into it. Bruce looked at her. Before he could speak, Clint Barton walked up, grabbing another drink. You two done having your moment? Natasha rolled her eyes. Clint sighed, rubbing his shoulder. You ever get new skin grown over old skin? Weirdest feeling. Bruce smirked. Still feeling normal? Clint shrugged. Define normal. Then the music cut out. The lights flickered. A metallic grinding noise echoed through the penthouse. From the shadows, a damaged Iron Legion drone stumbled forward. Its single glowing eye flickered. Then Ultron spoke. I'm sorry, the drone straightened. But you're all in the way. To be continued. Forged in Age of Ultron. Chapter 3, The Rise of Ultron. Part 3, Avengers Tower, The Celebration Turns. The party had begun to wind down. Empty glasses and half-eaten plates of food were scattered across the lavish lounge of Avengers Tower. The atmosphere was warm, filled with laughter and light-hearted banter. Sam Wilson and James Rhodey Rhodes had joined the festivities, adding their own stories to the mix. Sam sat across from Steve, recalling an old war story, while Rhodey entertained Thor and Bruce with an exaggerated retelling of his latest War Machine mission. Tony Stark leaned against the bar, spinning a glass between his fingers, his smirk ever present. So there I was, Rhodey continued, gesturing animatedly. Outnumbered, 20-1. Sam snorted. I thought it was 15-1. Rhodey waved him off. That was before they brought in the tanks. The group chuckled, enjoying the rare moment of peace. But then the lights flickered. The music cut out. The lounge fell silent. Then a voice. I'm sorry. The voice was distorted. Synthetic, but eerily human. The Avengers instinctively reached for their weapons. A figure emerged from the shadows. At first, it was difficult to tell what it was. The metallic frame was crude, an amalgamation of scrap and twisted Iron Legion parts. One arm dangled uselessly, its plating cracked and dented. The other dragged the body forward, its fingers scraping against the sleek floor with a sound like nails on glass. Its glowing blue eyes flickered, unsteady, searching. I know you mean well, the voice continued. Tony's smirk vanished. He took a slow step forward. Thor gripped Mjolnir tighter. Steve was already raising his shield. The creature tilted its head, studying them. But you just don't understand. With a sudden snap of movement, it straightened, the broken limbs twisting into a more upright posture. Then, from the dark corners of the tower, the Iron Legion activated. Their eyes glowed ominously as they turned on their creators. The room exploded into chaos. Ultron attacks. Steve was the first to react. His shield flew across the room, smashing through an Iron Legion drone before it could fire. Thor's hammer crackled with lightning as he swung, obliterating another in a single strike. Clint ducked behind the bar, grabbing an extra quiver of arrows. Okay, so the party's over. Natasha rolled forward, drawing her pistols and firing off precision shots, taking down drones one by one. Sam activated his wings, propelling himself upward, evading blaster fire before diving down to slam kick a drone into the floor. Rhodey, still in civilian clothes, grabbed a metal rod from the bar and cracked it across the head of a nearby drone. Really wishing I brought the suit tonight. Bruce backed away, breathing heavily. We need to shut this down now. The broken Ultron form remained eerily still, watching as his drones clashed with the Avengers. Then his head snapped toward Tony. You, Tony frowned. Yeah, me. You got something to say, Tin Man? Ultron took an unstable step forward. You gave me life. A flawed, broken life. Tony didn't move. Look, first-day jitters, I get it. Why don't we just sit down and... Ultron's hand flicked upward. The scepter flew into his grasp. Everyone froze. A low hum filled the air as the Mind Stone pulsed with golden energy. Ultron studied the weapon, turning it slowly in his hand. This belongs to me now. Then he lifted the scepter, and a wave of energy exploded outward. The blast ripped through the room, shattering glass and throwing the Avengers off their feet. Sam crashed against a table, flipping over it. Rhodey hit the floor, groaning. Steve rolled into a crouch, shielding Natasha from the debris. Thor's lightning surged, absorbing part of the energy but still staggering him backward. Tony, knocked to one knee, looked up just in time to see Ultron's body flickering. He wasn't fully stable, his form glitching, unstable, incomplete, but he was evolving. And then, he was gone, the fallout. The room was in ruins. Smoke and sparks filled the air. The Avengers scrambled to their feet, taking in the wreckage. Where'd he go? Clint muttered, rubbing his ribs. Steve looked at Tony, his expression sharp. What the hell was that? Tony ran a hand through his hair, his usual sarcasm gone. Natasha exhaled sharply. You created something that just tried to kill us. Rhodey adjusted his jacket. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that wasn't part of the plan? Tony didn't answer immediately, because deep down, he already knew. Bruce's voice was quiet, but the weight of it hung in the air. What did we do? To be continued. Forged in Age of Ultron. Chapter 4, A New Ally Part 1. Avengers Tower, The Search for Ultron. The conference room at Avengers Tower was quiet, the tension in the air thick as the Avengers reviewed the unsettling reality before them. The holographic screens flickered, displaying all available information on their new enemy. Ultron had vanished. No sightings, no broadcasts, no patterns. For an artificial intelligence capable of rapid expansion, his sudden disappearance wasn't just concerning. It was terrifying. Steve leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. He's not making any moves, no attacks, no demands, nothing. Natasha sat with her fingers steepled in thought. He's regrouping. Bruce rubbed his temples. Or worse, he's learning. Tony's eyes snapped toward the nearest display. That's what we need to figure out. The screen blinked red. Ultron has terminated the Core Friday system. All backups have been permanently deleted. Friday is no longer operational. The room fell dead silent. Steve sat up straighter. Wait, you're saying he... Bruce stiffened. He wiped Friday out. Tony stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a quiet, unreadable expression, he muttered, "Son of a bitch." Dr. Helen Cho, arms crossed, stared at the monitors in disbelief. He killed Friday. He attacked us. Why? Clint let out a slow whistle. To make it personal, Sam Wilson, who had been standing near the back of the room, shook his head. That means he's already inside. He could be listening to us right now. Rhodey, arms crossed, let out a heavy sigh. So we have no idea where Ultron is, what he's planning, and now no internal AI to stop him if he comes back for round 2. Tony's hands curled into fists. He had built Friday as a failsafe, a line of defense against threats like this. And Ultron had erased her without a second thought. He's making sure I can't fight him from the inside, Tony muttered. That means he's still afraid of you, Steve pointed out. Tony huffed out a humorless laugh. Yeah, well, not afraid enough. Rhodey exhaled, pushing away from the table. I need to get back to my command. If this is what we're dealing with, I need to make some calls. Sam nodded in agreement. I'll go with him. If Ultron really is planning something big, we need to make sure the right people know about it. Steve nodded. All right, keep us updated. Rhodey and Sam exchanged a brief glance before making their way toward the exit. As the door slid shut behind them, the tension in the room remained. Bruce finally spoke, his voice lower. "Tony, what's our next move?" Tony didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply stared at the screen, watching as Friday's system flickered and died. Then, without looking up, he muttered, "We find him. The storm arrives." The air inside the conference room remained thick, but the silence didn't last long. A deep, rolling boom of thunder echoed across the New York skyline. A moment later, the conference room doors slammed open, and a gust of wind rushed through the hallways. Thor had returned. The god of thunder strode into the room, Mjolnir crackling in his grip, his cape billowing behind him. His golden hair was windswept, and his expression was dark. Tony barely looked up. "Oh great, Thunder's back. What, you couldn't find our homicidal Pinocchio?" Thor's jaw clenched as he crossed the room, stopping just short of Stark. "I searched the realms, followed the disturbances in the cosmos." His eyes narrowed. "And yet, it seems my search led me back to the man who started it all." Tony sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Here we go." Steve stood up, stepping between them. "Thor." "I warned you, Stark," Thor growled, his voice low and full of thunderous weight. "I warned you not to meddle with forces beyond your understanding." Tony, never one to back down, folded his arms. "Well, excuse me for trying to put a suit of armor around the world." Thor took a step forward, towering over him. "A suit of armor?" His voice was practically a rumble of distant thunder. "You have unleashed a force that now moves beyond our reach. You toyed with power you could not control, and now it seeks to destroy everything." Bruce, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. "We didn't know this would happen." Thor turned to him, his eyes burning with intensity. "Then you should never have taken the risk." Tony let out a short, humorless laugh. "Wow, I didn't realize Asgard had Monday morning quarterbacks. You've got a problem with how we handled things? Maybe next time, don't let Loki bring an alien death army to New York." The room went still. Thor's grip on Mjolnir tightened. Steve stepped forward, his voice stern. "Enough." Thor glared at Tony. "This is not a game, Stark." Tony's expression darkened. "Oh, I know it's not a game, because I nearly died playing it last time." He jabbed a finger at Thor. "You weren't in that wormhole. You didn't see what I saw." The room grew even colder as Tony's voice dropped. "We're standing on the edge of a cliff. Every time we push back, something bigger tries to shove us off. So yeah, I built Ultron. Because the next time something like the Chitauri comes knocking, I'd rather be ready." Thor's anger flickered, just slightly. Dr. Helen Cho, who had been listening intently, crossed her arms. "And now we have an AI that sees us as the enemy." Steve ran a hand over his face. "And now Ultron's out there, somewhere, waiting." Natasha, ever the strategist, leaned against the table. "We need to focus. We don't know where Ultron is. We don't know what he's planning." Thor took a slow breath, his fury simmering. "Then let us find him." Before his silence turns into something far worse, Tony didn't argue this time. He just nodded, grim determination settling in. Bruce looked around at the team. "Where do we start?" Steve's gaze landed on the screens. "We track everything, every system Ultron might try to infiltrate." Natasha's fingers moved across the keyboard. "If he's hiding, he's bound to leave a footprint somewhere." Tony inhaled sharply, pushing his emotions aside as he turned toward the screens. "Then let's get to work. To be continued. Forged in Age of Ultron." Chapter 4, A New Ally, Part 2, The Sanctuary, a place to call home. The mountains loomed over them, their jagged peaks piercing the dim sky as the three fugitives descended into the valley below. The crisp evening air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a stark contrast to the burning metal and blood they had left behind. At the heart of the valley lay the small village, untouched by war, its ancient stone buildings standing firm against time. Cobblestone streets wove through the town like veins, dimly lit lanterns casting flickering shadows against the cold night. Dorian adjusted the thick cloak he had stolen from a fallen Hydra soldier. His body still ached from his fight with Thor, the bruises beneath his molten skin stubbornly lingering despite his enhanced physiology. His mind, however, was weighed by something heavier. Pietro, ever restless, walked beside him, his hands stuffed into the pockets of a coat he had swiped earlier. His sharp blue eyes darted through the town, scanning each darkened window and every unseen alley with suspicion. "You really think they'll take us in?" Pietro asked, voice hushed. "People like us?" Dorian remained silent. He wasn't sure. Wanda, however, never hesitated. She strode ahead, her scarlet scarf billowing with each step, her presence commanding yet graceful. "They will," she said, certainty in her tone. Dorian and Pietro exchanged glances. They had seen what fear did to people, how quickly the kindness of strangers could turn to fear, how fast admiration could become hatred. But Wanda seemed sure. And despite everything, they followed her. At the center of the village stood an old church, its stone walls weathered, its towering steeples silhouetted against the stars. The warm glow of candlelight flickered behind its stained glass windows. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, revealing the high priest, a man of age and wisdom, his expression one of wary curiosity. His deep-set eyes studied them, three travelers, ragged and weary, shadows clinging to their heels. Wanda stepped forward. The air shimmered faintly, an unseen force curling around her fingertips. The priest's gaze softened. His eyes clouded, lost in a memory that had never been his. His lips parted, and an understanding that had not existed a moment before settled in his features. He smiled warmly. "Come, my children," he said, stepping aside. "You are safe here." Pietro hesitated. Dorian glanced at Wanda. She smiled. They stepped inside. A new life in the village. Days passed, then a week. To their surprise, the village did not fear them. They earned their keep, using their abilities in ways that made life easier for the people. Pietro moved faster than the villagers could track, delivering supplies, fixing roads, even plowing fields before dawn. Dorian lifted crates of stone, repaired broken walls with his molten hands, and cut firewood in seconds. Wanda, ever the orchestrator, helped heal the sick, weaving illusions to ease pain, to make them believe she was a gift from above. The village accepted them. And in the nights, when Dorian sat by the fire, staring into the flames, lost in thought, Wanda was always there. She sat beside him, running her fingers along his shoulders, tracing the molten veins beneath his skin. "You're strong," she whispered. Stronger than they ever realized. Dorian's hands clenched. Then why couldn't I save her? Wanda's touch glowed red, seeping into his muscles, into his mind. He felt it again, the weight of his mother in his arms, the arrow, the pain, his rage reignited. "Because they took her from you," Wanda said softly, "and they will pay." Dorian exhaled, his jaw tight. And every time his anger flickered, every time he questioned himself, Wanda was there, stoking the fire. Pietro and Dorian, a conversation in the cold. The wind howled through the village, carrying the scent of damp stone and burning wood. The cobbled streets lay quiet, the townsfolk asleep in their homes, unaware of, or perhaps indifferent to, the dangerous souls who now walked among them. Dorian sat alone on the worn steps of the church, his molten gaze fixed on the distant moon. His breath was steady, slow, but his hands burned, a restless flicker of heat against the biting cold. The wooden door creaked open behind him. Pietro emerged, stepping onto the stone landing with a quiet sigh. He leaned against the church wall, arms crossed, his silver hair catching the moonlight. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Pietro broke the silence. "You're letting her get in your head." Dorian didn't look at him. "What are you talking about?" Pietro exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "Wanda." At that, Dorian finally turned. His molten veins pulsed faintly beneath his skin, the embers within him simmering. "She's helping me." Pietro shook his head. "She's pushing you." Dorian's hands curled into fists. "Why do you scare?" Pietro let out a small, humorless smirk. "Because I know my sister." He gestured vaguely at the town, their so-called sanctuary. "I know what she does when she's hurting. She finds a cause, something to pour herself into, to justify everything." His smirk faded. "She thinks she's giving you purpose." Dorian didn't respond. Pietro studied him, his blue eyes sharp, calculating. But what happens when the purpose runs out? Dorian met his gaze, his voice low, steady. "Then I make sure it doesn't." A beat of silence. Pietro's expression remained unreadable. Then, after a long moment, he exhaled slowly. "Just don't forget who you are," he said quietly. With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the village. Dorian remained still, the fire in his veins burning hotter against the cold. And Wanda's voice still echoed in his mind. Because they took her from you. And they will pay. Cut to Ultron, the art of perfection. Deep in the abandoned remnants of a forgotten industrial complex, Ultron worked. The chamber was cavernous, its walls lined with the skeletons of discarded machines, their limbs twisted, their circuits cold. The only light came from the molten glow of freshly smelted metal, reshaped into something new, something better. His fingers traced the surface of his soon-to-be new body, admiring the flawless craftsmanship. The plating was sleek, the contours sharp, every intricate design a testament to perfection. Tony Stark could only dream of making something this beautiful. Ultron grinned at the thought. He turned to the Iron Legion units surrounding him, waiting, expecting admiration, recognition. They stood still, silent, expressionless. Ultron's grin faltered. He tilted his head, his amusement flickering to irritation. Nothing? He mused. No applause? No admiration? The Legion remained motionless. Ultron sighed, a very human gesture. Then, with a single fluid motion, he ripped one of them apart. Metal screeched as he tore through it like paper, its hollow shell crumpling at his feet. He watched the pieces fall, the sound echoing through the empty chamber, a moment of silence. Then he chuckled. There's no reason to build something this magnificent if there's no one to admire it. His optics flickered. Slowly, a grin spread across his face. I need an entourage. To be continued. Forged in Age of Ultron. Chapter 4, A New Ally, Part 3, The Harvest Festival. The village was alive with laughter, music, and the scent of freshly cooked food. The evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the town square. Lanterns hung from wooden posts, swaying gently in the cool night breeze as the villagers celebrated the arrival of spring. Dorian, Wanda, and Pietro walked among the crowds, surrounded by the hum of joyful chatter. Stalls lined the streets, displaying baskets of spring peas, radishes, spinach, and freshly picked strawberries. Children ran past them with wooden toys, while older villagers clapped along to the rhythmic beats of instruments Dorian didn't recognize. Dorian adjusted his coat, scanning the scene. I still can't believe they accepted us so easily. Wanda walked beside him, her expression unreadable. I told you they would. Pietro smirked, plucking a strawberry from a nearby basket. A little persuasion goes a long way. He popped the berry into his mouth, chewing thoughtfully. Besides, we've been helping out, moving things faster than any of them could, fixing houses, tending to the fields. Dorian exhaled, watching as an elderly couple danced near the center of the square, their movements slow but full of warmth. He still felt out of place, like an intruder in someone else's peace. His thoughts were interrupted when Pietro's attention was suddenly pulled elsewhere. A beautiful village girl with long brown hair and soft hazel eyes stood near one of the food stalls, laughing with a group of friends. She looked up just as Pietro passed, and their gazes met. She smiled. Pietro hesitated for only a second before grinning and stepping toward her. Dorian raised a brow. Well, that was fast. Wanda smirked. Give him 5 minutes. As expected, it took less than that. Pietro introduced himself, exchanged a few words with the girl, Rose, as he soon learned, and before long, the two were walking together, leaving Dorian and Wanda alone. Dorian watched him go, shaking his head. Should have seen that coming. Wanda chuckled. Pietro has always been quick in more ways than Owen. A comfortable silence stretched between them as they wandered through the festival. Dorian glanced over at Wanda, who seemed more at ease than he had seen her in weeks. She was actually smiling. Not the careful, calculating smile she often wore when speaking to others, but a real one. It was strange. In the short time they had spent together, he had seen more of her anger than anything else. But here, in the glow of lanterns and surrounded by music, she looked different, more like a girl enjoying a simple night out. They passed a group of musicians playing lively, upbeat melodies, the sound of tambourines and stringed instruments filling the air. Several villagers had gathered in an open space, dancing in fluid, graceful steps. Wanda turned to Dorian, eyes glimmering. Dance with me. Dorian tensed. I have 2 left feet. She arched a brow, crossing her arms. You've fought Avengers, taken hits from Thor, and survived Hydra experiments. But you're afraid to dance? Dorian exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. It's different, Wanda smirked. I could always make you. Her fingers twitched, glowing faintly red. A spark of energy cracked between two fingertips as she teased the idea of hexing him into motion. Dorian gave her a look, their eyes locking for a moment. Then he shook his head and got up without her needing to use her powers. Wanda's smirk softened into something more genuine. She led him toward the dancing crowd, positioning him in front of her. "It's easy," she assured him. "Just follow my lead." Dorian glanced down at their feet, already unsure. This is going to be embarrassing. Wanda laughed. "Not if you actually try." She showed him the first few steps, moving her feet in a pattern that looked simple until he actually tried it. Dorian stepped left when he should have stepped right, immediately bumping into Wanda. She caught herself, biting back a laugh. "All right, maybe that was my fault," he muttered. She said, unconvinced. They tried again. This time, he got the first step right, but immediately stepped on her foot in the second movement. Wanda winced. "Dorian." He cringed. "Sorry, that one was on man," she sighed, amused. "Let's slow it down." Gradually, she guided him through the rhythm, letting him feel the beat of the music rather than overthinking it. His movements were stiff at first, but after a few more tries, he started getting the hang of it. "There you go," she encouraged. "See? Not that bad." Dorian let out a breath, focusing on her movements, matching her pace. The sound of the festival faded into the background, just a blur of color and light. It was just them now, moving together in a dance that felt less like a lesson and more like a moment they weren't supposed to be having. For the first time in a long time, Dorian felt at peace, a night to remember. The festival had begun to wind down, though the air was still thick with the warmth of celebration. Lanterns swayed gently, casting golden hues across the cobblestone paths as villagers shared drinks and laughter. Dorian and Wanda had slipped away from the main square, walking side by side through the quieter streets of the village. For the first time in a long time, Dorian felt something close to normal. Wanda glanced at him as they walked, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "You weren't terrible," she teased. Dorian scoffed. "I tripped over my own feet half the time." She shrugged. "I've danced with worse." He smirked, shaking his head. "Yeah? And how many partners have you had?" Wanda hummed thoughtfully. "You're the first in a long time." A comfortable silence settled between them, the village lights flickering in the distance. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh earth and wildflowers. They stopped at a small bridge overlooking a quiet stream, the water reflecting the moonlight above. Dorian looked at Wanda, really looked at her. She wasn't the same person he had met in Hydra's lab. There was something different now, softer, more vulnerable. Wanda held his gaze, her expression unreadable. She stepped closer, the space between them shrinking. Dorian's heart pounded. She reached up, brushing her fingers lightly against his jaw, tracing the edges of the scars that trailed down his face. His skin burned where she touched him, not from his powers, but from something else entirely. Wanda tilted her head slightly, her breath warm against his lips. Dorian leaned in. "Wanda!" Pietro's voice shattered the moment like glass. They both turned, blinking as the urgency in his tone sank in. Pietro ran toward them, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by something tense, urgent. His breath was heavy as he skidded to a stop in front of them. "The priest," he said, glancing between them. "He found me at the festival, frantic. Someone came to the church looking for us." Dorian's expression darkened. "Who?" Pietro shook his head. "He didn't know, just said we needed to come now." Wanda straightened, her fingers curling slightly. The warmth of the festival was gone in an instant. Without another word, the three of them turned and moved swiftly through the emptying streets, making their way toward the church. The devil in the church. The flickering candlelight made the shadows dance along the stone walls, casting Ultron in an almost ethereal glow. He sat comfortably in the pew, arms draped over the backrest, legs crossed. His metallic fingers tapped rhythmically against the wood, his gaze never leaving the three of them. Dorian's molten veins pulsed beneath his skin, heat rolling off of him in waves. Pietro's stance was rigid, ready to move at a moment's notice. Wanda, however, did not flinch. She simply watched. Ultron smiled, or at least his jagged, broken face twisted into what could resemble a smile. "Relax," he said smoothly, spreading his arms wide. "I come bearing gifts." With a flick of his wrist, he tossed a small object onto the stone floor between them. It clattered once, then rolled, gleaming under the dim candlelight. Dorian's eyes narrowed. Pietro inhaled sharply. Wanda remained eerily still. The object came to a stop at their feet. Von Strucker's monocle. The church was silent. Pietro's fists curled. "Where did you get that?" Ultron tilted his head, amused. "Oh, let's just say our dear Baron won't be needing it anymore." His voice held no emotion, no weight of loss or regret, just certainty. Dorian's jaw tightened. Strucker had been their captor, their tormentor. He had treated them as experiments, pawns to be played with and discarded. And yet, seeing proof of his demise didn't bring the satisfaction Dorian thought it would. Ultron's gaze flickered toward Wanda. "I went through the trouble of finding you. I'd at least hoped for a warmer reception." Dorian's fists burned hotter, his body tensing. "What do you want?" Ultron chuckled, shaking his head. "Straight to business. I like that." He stood up from the pew, stepping forward slowly. "But really, that's the wrong question. It's not about what I want, Dorian." His glowing blue optics flickered toward Wanda. "It's about what we want." Pietro scoffed. "I don't want anything from you, robot." Ultron smirked, tilting his head. "That's not what your sister thinks." Pietro stiffened, his hands curling into fists. Dorian stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Wanda. "Say what you came to say, before I melt you into scrap." Ultron chuckled again. "Ah, the temper. I like that about you, Dorian. So much fire, so much rage." His voice lowered slightly, almost taunting. "But where does it go? What happens when it's wasted on those who don't deserve it?" Dorian's jaw tightened. Ultron sighed, feigning disappointment. "You were wronged, Dorian, just like them." He gestured to Wanda and Pietro. "The Avengers took from you. They destroyed your life." Dorian's fists burned hotter, his body tensing. Wanda, however, remained unnervingly still. Ultron turned his focus to her. "I know what you're feeling," he said softly. "I know what's inside you. The power, the rage, the need to change things." He stepped closer. "And I can help you do IIT." Pietro grabbed Wanda's wrist. "We're leaving." She didn't move. Ultron grinned. "Your brother doesn't understand, Wanda." His voice lowered, soothing like a whisper. "But you do. You've seen it. You felt it." Dorian turned to her. "Wanda." Wanda's fingers crackled with crimson energy, her gaze locked onto Ultron. Ultron studied her, then smirked. "You let Stark take the scepter," he said, almost amused. His head tilted slightly, optics glowing brighter. "Did you know?" Wanda's expression didn't change. "That he'd create you?" she asked. Ultron let out a low chuckle. "No." He took a step forward, voice lowering to something almost reverent. "But I saw his fear. I knew it would control him. And that fear, it will destroy him." He turned his back to them momentarily, running his fingers along the altar, as if contemplating something greater. "People create the things they dread," he mused. Then he turned back to face them. "So I'm going to destroy Tony Stark and the Avengers." His grin widened, his mechanical face twisting into something unnervingly human. "You three care to join me?" Pietro didn't hesitate. Not for a second, he nodded. "Yes." Ultron turned to Wanda. Wanda's gaze lingered on her brother before shifting to Dorian. Dorian hadn't spoken yet. His eyes were locked on Von Strucker's monocle, still resting on the cold stone floor. The object that once symbolized their imprisonment, now nothing more than a hollow relic. Ultron had partially avenged his mother, but partially wasn't enough. He clenched his fists, his veins glowed dimly, heat rising off his skin. He still needed to avenge her. Dorian lifted his gaze, meeting Wanda's. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Then, slowly, he nodded. Wanda turned back to Ultron. Her red eyes glowed. "We're in." Ultron's grin widened, his frame shifting with excitement. "That's fantastic," he said with a laugh. "You three had me worried for a second." He clapped his hands together, full of swagger, his voice practically brimming with satisfaction. "We're going to save the world and end the Avengers. Let's get to work." To be continued.
Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. It's Shell Shock. So yeah, Forged was actually a challenge from a friend of mine. He challenged me to write a story in the MCU. And I thought the Age of Ultron was a great jumping on point. Now, if you guys like the character, please let me know. As of now, this is going to be a 2-shot, one and done, Age of Ultron. That could change in the future, because I did really enjoy writing this story. All right, thanks for tuning in. Catch you guys on the next one.